going to conferences all the time is the main driver for progress in your skill set and also your relationship, and basically any professional can become a better professional by attending conferences.
It's not the standard, okay? It's a movie theater, but the visual is great and the sound is great, and I've seen a lot of room and space, and I think it's organized well.
Seeing all the people here today and they're excited about stuff, you can see the energy and the desire to learn and do new things.
And I was positively surprised about the depth, the technical depth of the sessions, and how that makes the tester part of the team.
I think developers do benefit from coming to QA conferences, just the same as testers can benefit from going to dev conferences. You've got to have a broad understanding of what's going on.
It's really inclusive. I would say it's super diverse. People are really open and friendly, and it's really organized.
Conferences are well worthwhile just for the ideas that they spark in people. When people come back to the office, they're full of ideas and they're all energized up.
Hi, I'm Baumann from Germany, and my job is being a software tester at a fintech startup. To a certain degree, learning new technologies and skills and already providing value is normal when joining a new project. But when joining my latest project, I had to do both to an extreme I had never experienced before. In this talk, I will share my story and the strategies I use to manage this challenge. I look at what aspects testers and other IT professionals can take to manage these sort of situations. I hope you enjoy the talk. Hello and welcome to my talk, Extreme Learning Situations as Testers. How to add value while you're still learning. My name is Baumann and I'm a software tester. For more about me, you can check out my Twitter. There's a link to my different profiles in my bio. When tweeting about this talk, please use the hashtag TestCon. So, let's start. Let me explain you what this talk is about. When joining a new project or taking on a new role, it is often required to learn new skills and technologies. Be it a new business domain, a new test tool, a new technology the product is built with, a new test technique or kind of testing, or whatever else. Also, we often feel the need or are told of the need to provide value to the project quickly. Both of these competing expectations are normal to a certain degree, and working in IT, we are used to that, be it as testers, programmers, or whatever our job title is. When I started a new job at a fintech startup last year, joining a project where it was my task to test an API against the European Union standard for payment services, I had to do both to an extreme I had never experienced before. The list of things to learn from almost the ground was long. Let's briefly talk about the application under test. The Payment Service Directive PSD2 is an EU directive to regulate payment services throughout the European Union. One of the central ideas of PSD2 is open banking. A bank offers every customer the option of third-party services accessing their accounts via a dedicated bank interface on their behalf. The third-party service provider can use the sales data to analyze the finances or precisely check the creditworthiness. Another service provider transfers money to a dealer on behalf of the customer. The dealer receives the confirmation and can send the goods immediately. The bank's PSD2 interface has 4 important properties. First, banks only have to provide them for payment accounts. Second, PSD2 limits the interfaces to access by third-party providers who operate from their own servers and are approved by a national financial supervisory authority in the European Union. Thirdly, the interface have to provide the same functions as the normal online banking of the bank, and they must lock all accesses. Finally, the account holder must have given explicit and revocable consent to access beforehand. The main points relevant for the testing are: it's a REST API, and the specification comes from a European institution, thus is relatively difficult to comprehend because of its very official language. So, the main things I needed to learn were testing an API. I basically knew what an API is. You send a request and get some data back. But how to test that? I needed to perform exploratory testing in order to learn about the API and to find problems. Automate the tests using Postman. We had promised our clients to give them a set of Postman tests, so they would be able to perform some checks on their own. Thus, Postman was set. Also, for banks in Luxembourg, the financial regulator demanded performance tests being executed. Beyond being aware of the existence of some API testing tools like Postman and SoapUI, my knowledge about API testing was quite close to zero. I also had to learn the specification, which consisted of 400 pages, authored by a public institution, thus very detailed, overstructured and overcomplete, and quite difficult to comprehend. Finally, I had to learn the business domain. I never worked in the financial industry before, so I had to at least grasp the basics. What's a consent and how does it work? How does a payment work? What different types of payments exist and how do they differ? To name just a few things to be learned within the business domain. Despite all these things to learn, other project members were expecting valuable contributions from me shortly after joining. Luckily, nobody ever put any direct pressure on me. Just certain things were in the room, plus the pressure I put myself under. But that might be different in other contexts. Some expectations. I joined April 1st. The instructed go-live date for the UAT environment was June 14th. So that was roughly 2.5 months. It was expected that the system is completely tested, whatever completely tested means, before that date. Another expectation was that I should find all the bugs. Another very questionable statement. The test automation should be fast-forwarded. The Postman tests needed to be completed to be delivered to our clients. When I joined, only skeletons existed and only a fraction of cases was covered. Performance tests needed to be done before the end of April. So, let me share with you some stories of my project and explain the strategies, techniques and tools I used to deal with all the competing requirements. First of all, it is important to find out about what the most important priority is or what the most important priorities are, so that you have a starting point. But how to do that? First of all, talk to the people involved in the project and to the stakeholders about what their priorities are. Question those priorities. Ask why those are priorities to them. Often, there will be a misalignment between different people involved in the project, and it's part as our job as testers to spot and clarify them. Second, bring your own judgment as tester to the table. You're a skilled and experienced professional, and you're totally able to get the job done. That's the reason you got hired or assigned. So don't be shy. You have something to bring to the project. Bringing your judgment to the table might change estimates, deadlines, or priorities. For example, someone with little to zero knowledge might have given a totally unrealistic estimate about how much time is needed to set up and execute performance tests. Ask questions like, What exactly shall be achieved? What is required or shall be done? What is the goal? At least certain aspects of the project and the priorities might change because of that. And it will result in a clearer view on what is a priority. Third point about finding out about priorities is to check deadlines and plan accordingly. This planning should be updated regularly by redoing the before mentioned steps, but also based on your learnings and new inputs and insights. Next, I'll talk about how I handled multiple parallel tasks throughout the project. We all know that multitasking is far from being ideal, but sometimes it's hard to get around it. Okay, if you cannot avoid multitasking, be at least aware of the negative effects it has. And your boss should be aware of these too. You get tired faster. You easily feel overwhelmed. You tend to make more mistakes. Most important thing to consider is focus. Things that help to focus on a specific task are: avoid task switching too often. Stay focused. Work in bigger blocks of at least 2 hours to avoid too much task switching. If you have too many meetings, try to block time in your calendar for working. Task switching costs up to 40% of someone's productive time. There are various studies with different numbers out there, but this is not about the absolute truth, but to get an idea. Come to the office early or stay late. Not to work over hours, but early and late, the office is relatively quiet and there are less people there to disturb you. Another possibility to avoid the usual office distractions is to work from home. Well, before the pandemic and the kids being homeschooled all day. A great tool to use is the Pomodoro Technique. Pomodoro is Italian and means tomato. The technique has that name because of those old-fashioned kitchen timers that often have the shape of a tomato. How does the technique work? Basically, you work on a task in blocks of 25 minutes, followed by a 5 minutes break. Within that 25 minutes, you don't work on anything else and avoid any distractions. No emails, no phone calls, no WhatsApp, no Facebook. Every 4 blocks, you take a bigger break of around 20 minutes. This is how I back then used to plan and organize my work days with the Pomodoro Technique, based on the book Pomodoro Technique Illustrated by Staffan Noteberg. Every day, first thing I did is to list the tasks that need to be done or that I plan to work on. Then I start working on them, according to their priority and where I need to make or want to make progress. For every started Pomodoro session, I add a little box just behind the task. If I managed to successfully work on that task for 25 minutes without any interruptions, I check the box with a green hook. In case I didn't manage that, for example, I got a phone call or I got interrupted by a colleague, I check the box with a red cross. If a new task turns up, for example, as a follow-up of a meeting, or my boss sends me an email asking to do something, then I add it to the bottom of the list and evaluate if I need to start working on that immediately or not. According to Staffan's book, meetings are not to be listed here, but putting them on the list as well gives me a more complete overview of where I spend my time at the end of the day. This doesn't have to be 100% accurate. If it's a 30 minutes meeting, I tick one box, which in Pomodoro represents 25 minutes. If it's a 1 hour meeting, I tick 2 boxes. The next day, I check what is left from the day before and what new tasks have come in, for example from an email, or I see that some Jenkins tests are failing. Also a meeting might be scheduled for that day. When I tried the Pomodoro technique for the very first time, the biggest surprise was how much I was able to accomplish in only 25 minutes. Also, it is a great way to track where you spend your time during the day. At the office, I have a big hourglass that I can look at. And I also informed my colleagues to please not interrupt me when the hourglass is running, and that they at max have to wait for me for 25 minutes to be available. Another surprise, it also helps me with tasks I don't like doing. For example, writing documentation or writing in general. I tell myself, just 2 Pomodoros of writing, that'll be enough for the day. And then I just start doing it. And within 2 Pomodoros, I can write a lot of documentation. So it also helps me a lot with getting unliked tasks done. Besides focusing, what are other ways to handle multitasking if you think you cannot avoid it? First of all, evaluate if you really have to multitask. Talk to your stakeholders and your boss. Tell them, for example, do you want both of these tasks to be ready in 2 weeks? Or is it okay to focus on one at a time? Deliver the first one by the end of this week and the second task done by the end of next week? Most likely, I will be done with both tasks in less than 2 weeks because I'm not losing time due to task switching. Next, you should evaluate if you can eliminate unnecessary things or if there are things that you can supervise or delegate. Also check what you can simplify. Here's some other advantages of the Pomodoro technique come into play. Pomodoro helps you learning to concentrate and to work in blocks of time, what I said earlier. It also is a great help in avoiding procrastination and distraction. You also should make a plan and establish personal goals. Techniques like bullet journaling or momentum planners also help with that. You need to align your priorities regularly. For that, you should check with the team, the stakeholders, and your boss. It is also very important to accept your limits, to work at a sustainable pace, and to take breaks when you need them. Let's talk about learning while doing. How does learning an instrument work? Do you study music theory for a couple of years and only when you master it, access an instrument for the very first time? Certainly not. The instructor tells you just a tiny little bit on how to get started. You practice that, and with each lesson, you learn and practice a little bit more about every aspect, theory and practice about how to play that instrument, and over time, you become proficient. Remember, it doesn't have to be perfect from the beginning. Very often, it doesn't even need to be perfect in the end, but that's a topic for a talk on its own. I didn't have the time to first acquire all the necessary skills, not even talking about bringing them to perfection. I followed a similar approach as when learning an instrument. Just studying enough to get me started. Then try to use that and improve over time. Let me give you an example of that. When I arrived, in the existing Postman tests, there was a gap. You had to copy a URL from Postman, paste it into the browser, and perform an action on a website. Then continue the flow in Postman. The project manager, who initially created that tests, thought that Postman is for APIs only. But it's for all kinds of HTTP requests. And this is basically what a browser is doing. Sending HTTP requests and displaying and rendering the returned HTML. With my previous web UI automation knowledge, I was able to bridge that gap and automate the whole flow in Postman, which enabled us to run the Postman tests via continuous integration. Not the biggest progress in testing the API, but I learned a lot about Postman and especially about JavaScript. Also, we could execute the tests fully automated and unattended without any manual interaction, and that was a great step forward. Another example is my workflow in the first weeks for creating a test in Postman. First, I created only the requests to First, I created only the request to create an item via the API, without any tests. I then added more requests to the workflow, for example, to retrieve the newly created item from the API. I then added tests, for example, to check if the requests return the correct HTTP status code, if the created items are correct, and so on. Next step was to parameterize the requests and the tests. For example, the URL was unique per each client, so I introduced variables instead of hard coding that values. I left the difficult parts until the very end. For example, how to iterate over a nested JSON array with JavaScript to check specific values within the JSON data. To not bring something to perfection, but only to a good enough state, is an often used principle and is applied in many engineering disciplines, and it also makes sense for software projects. Also, studies have shown another big advantage of learning by doing is that knowledge is much more likely to be acquired from learning by doing than from learning by reading, listening, or even thinking. Another thing that can save you a lot of time is to look out for patterns. If you often have to do the same or similar tasks, it can make sense to set up a general structure or process, a kind of a blueprint that you can reuse. This can save you a lot of time. The point is, you should not end up doing like the guy on the right. During the course of the project, it turned out that we not only had to do performance testing in one sandbox environment, as it was initially announced, but the Luxembourgish regulator demanded that the UAT environment of every client also needed to be performance tested and to be compliant with their performance requirements. In our case, the UAT environments were a pre-production environment, which were linked to the client's test environments, whereas the sandbox environments only had a database with some fake test data. By the way, let's have a look at the requirements for that performance tests demanded by the regulator. Capability of the dedicated interface to support access by multiple merchants at the same time. This to ensure that each merchant can only access the data of its own clients. To me, this is more functional than a performance requirement. Capability of the dedicated interface to deal with extremely high numbers of requests. Okay, this makes sense for performance tests, but what is an extremely high number? This was up for the clients to decide and has led us to some very interesting conversations, as some clients had really unrealistic ideas about what an extremely high number of requests is. Use of an extremely high number of concurrent open sessions, for example, open at the same time. This definitely makes no sense for an API, as there are no open sessions. You send a request, you get a response, end of story. But no sessions like in web applications, for example. Guess someone at the regulator simply copy-pasted from some other template, but as my colleagues could tell me from earlier experiences, arguing with the regulator about their requirements would have been totally pointless. Requests for large volumes of data. This one also makes sense, but what does large mean? The typical requests and responses for that API have a couple of kilobytes in size. Initially, we had a hard time to explain clients that we don't want to move mega or even gigabytes of data, as that's not a very realistic use case of the API. But that was their idea of large volumes of data. Back to me, trying to improve my process and toolset. At first, we discussed the client's needs for the performance tests in UAT with each client individually, leading to very different requirements for each client, especially concerning things like, what is the duration of one performance test run? How many parallel users should be used during a performance test run? What is a large volume of data? What is an extremely high number of concurrent open sessions? and many, many more. Additionally, we didn't use a proper performance test tool, but some command line tools that simply executed the Postman tests in parallel, which was a nightmare to maintain. And also, the reporting was pretty bad and required a lot of manual effort. But initially, it was meant to be a one-time thing, and thus okay. It was, no surprise, not maintainable for more than 20 clients. So I drafted performance tests for each of the criteria of the regulator in JMeter and explained those in a document we handed out to the clients. A lot of values had been set by us, which avoided a lot of discussions with the clients. Some values, like the number of parallel users per test, were based on the usage data of the client's web banking, and those we asked the clients to provide us. I then set up a little framework in the performance test tool JMeter, which I could easily reuse. Values that changed per client could be adapted via a handful of config files with very little effort. But be careful. Getting things up and running and maintaining them can take a lot of time. Don't maintain a process or an automation solution just for the sake of maintaining something, but only do so if you benefit from it. The shown comic is about automating a repetitive task with the intent to do a one-time effort to automate that task and save time in the long run. But very often, the maintenance and further development of that automation takes more time than it took to manually perform the initial task. Another important thing to do is manage expectations. Let me tell you a story about this. Not from one of my projects, but one that some of you might remember. In 2011, a few weeks before Steve Jobs passed, the Apple stock dropped a good few percentage points. It was not the death of Steve Jobs that brought the valuation down, since that was factored into the stock market years ago when he first began to get sick. But it was because the market expected something, but then did not get it. Apple holds a conference every year, and every year the event is exciting because of new products being announced. The speculation all those years ago was that the iPhone 5 was going to be announced. Unfortunately for Apple's stock at the time, instead of the phone you can see on the left, the iPhone 5, the news was about the phone on the right, an iPhone 4S, an upgrade to the phone already on the market. The industry was less than impressed with this, and thus stock was sold. In this example, the market already factored in one big expectation, the death of a visionary business leader. However, something as small as expecting a phone with a 5 and getting a 4S instead resulted in a stock price drop. But what is expectation management? A formal definition I found is: expectation management is a formal process to continuously capture, document, and maintain the content, dependencies, and sureness of the expectations for persons participating in an interaction, and to apply the information to make the interaction successful. Pretty difficult to comprehend. Let's simplify that by just looking at the core of it. Expectation management is a process to make the interaction with people successful. To a large extent, people declare that a project has either succeeded or failed based on whether it met their expectations. Only very few projects fail in an absolute sense, but a lot of projects simply fail to meet individual expectations. It is possible for a project to fail, even if all the original goals were met, simply based on someone's different perception. By the way, this sounds pretty similar to Jerry Weinberg's definition of quality and the addition to it by James Buck. Quality is value to some person who matters. But discussing that would be content for a very own talk. So, what should you do in order to manage expectations properly? Here's what worked for me. What you should keep in mind is that expectations are based on what has come before. And because everybody has different experiences and thus different expectations, it's important to make clear to stakeholders what to expect. Keep your stakeholders informed, because nobody likes surprises. Talk to your stakeholders regularly and let them know what you achieved and what you'll tackle next. Try to give them a timeline. Yes, estimates are difficult. But I'm not talking about absolute figures and promises here, but about when you think you can accomplish what. Make clear that you're giving estimates, not promises. Involving people earlier versus surprising them is very effective over time, for both building trust and for managing expectations more effectively. Also, you need to clearly articulate the risks you see. It can be easy to get caught up on focusing on all the positive at the expense of calling out the risks. You should report obstacles, and especially if you think something is not feasible, that you, for example, cannot reach a deadline or might not be able to acquire the necessary knowledge in the given time. Finally, have a backup plan. This helps to set the frame that things can go wrong, and if they do, nobody is surprised. And if things go wrong, you are prepared. It also shows that you have thought through the problem. Besides all the advices and hints how to work on such a project, it is also very important that you stay healthy. For that, you should try not to get overwhelmed by your work. Leave work at work and don't take it home. Let me share a story from a project where I was not able to do so. I was a test project lead for the very first time in my career, and the project was doomed from the very first day. But me as a newbie was not able to see that back then. It was a project in waterfall mode, and there was an intensive 2 weeks testing phase scheduled, which meant subject matter experts and testers were locked into a room to test quality in. This project was so very much eating me up. I had a notepad and pen on my nightstand because I woke up in the middle of the night thinking about project-related stuff I didn't want to forget, so I could write that down. It was a very stressful time and not healthy at all, and over time, I learned to leave work at work. In general, don't get into the hamster wheel. Alex Schladebeck and Hype Shots gave an impressive keynote about that at Agile Testing Days 2018, and you can find a recording of that on YouTube. So much for my experiences, how I handled the challenges, and what else can work in such a situation. Let's talk about some more general how-to questions. How do you avoid such situations? Are there other people that can help out, that can join or support the project? Can you find them inside your own organization, in your team, in different teams or departments? Or maybe you need to look outside of your organization. Should someone be hired? Can part of the work be outsourced? Or does it make sense to bring consultants on board? If you believe that you're in such a project, make it clear right from the beginning that it is impossible to succeed, but give detailed reasons for why this is the case. How do you recognize and talk about such projects? Ask questions like, do we have the right people and skills? Do we have enough manpower? Whom do we have to get on board? How much do we have to learn? What are the deadlines to provide results? Is that feasible? If you're already caught in such a project, try to step back, get out of the hamster wheel, and make yourself aware that you are in such a project. Talking about such projects in your organization can be difficult, depending on the company culture. But you have to raise it anyhow, because if you don't speak up, there's a 100% chance of nothing to be changed. Finally, how to prevent such projects. The mandatory preconditions for prevention is that you need to have recognized that such a project is going to happen, and you need to talk about it. What I said about expectation management earlier is key. Manage expectations and take actions to execute the project better. That was my talk. Many thanks for your attention. I hope you found some useful bits for your work, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Okay, thanks for being at my talk. A couple of questions came up. How do you deal with clients who insist on unrealistic performance testing requirements? Actually, we had that case. First of all, you try, of course, to explain why you think their expectations or their requirements are unrealistic. Especially when testing APIs, the requirements are not one-to-one comparable with a desktop or a web application. So that's what we did. And I remember we had one case where a client wanted to have every test executed 10 times in order to find out if the results are reliable. And we just clearly told them that that is way too much effort, and even the regulator is not demanding that. So we just denied to execute every run 10 times. Next, where we can find more information of this Pomodoro technique, maybe you can recommend a book or training online. So I started it by simply working in 25 minutes blocks with a short break after that and taking note of that. I then later on read the book Pomodoro Technique Explained by Stefan Noteberg, and that helped me a lot. I adapted that technique a little bit for me. There are a lot of apps and websites online where you can get the timer functionality, but you don't need a big training or something for that. Just start working in 25 minutes blocks without any distractions. That's the main thing. If you want to go deeper, I can recommend the book. Who should have the final word on criteria like performance, customer development, operations? Do you think we have enough information to make a case? Well, that always depends a bit on the situation. What I didn't tell you in that talk is that the regulator in Luxembourg also gave some hard criteria. So for example, only, I don't recall exactly, 3 or 4% of all responses were allowed to take longer than 5 seconds, and none were allowed to take longer than 30 seconds. It always depends a little bit. If you're in an agile context, I think it should be also the team, and should be part of the definition of done. It can be other stakeholders. If you, for example, are developing a software for a client, then it's of course the client who puts that as part of the requirements. But it always depends. You cannot give a general answer on this, I think. Do you think it is possible that some people can be more efficient while multitasking? Is it their natural way of working? No, I clearly don't think so. And all the resources I found when researching and what I heard when talking to other people about multitasking, it's just too time consuming, especially getting your mind in the right state to work on that other task. Just the task switching takes too much time. What happens when there are conflicting values to different stakeholders? Do you facilitate that discussions or let them fight it out? Well, that's similar to the priorities, what I talked about at the very beginning of the talk. You should try to moderate and negotiate between them, because it will be harmful for the project or even for the company if we have that different expectations, that different understanding of priorities of what is important. So you should try to moderate that, or at least make that different opinions, that different expectations that are in the room, make them visible. Okay, that's it. All questions answered. I will now join the Zoom for the Ask Me Anything corner. Thanks again for coming to my talk. Bye-bye.